مكرم. فطبعا هناك آخرة بالنسبة لمن يؤمن بوجود الإله، إنما واحد مش مؤمن بوجود الإله أنا مش محتاج أصلا إني أقنعه بوجود الآخرة.
Andy Newberg is the founding father of neurotheology, a new branch of neuroscience that studies the effects of spirituality on the human brain. It's a scientific quest he has pursued as long as he can remember.
Ever since I was a kid, I was very interested in trying to understand reality. I was disturbed by the fact that everyone was looking at the same reality, and yet there were people of different religions and different political beliefs.
Andy found the way to peer inside the brains of believers while they were in the midst of a religious ritual. It's the highest of high-tech brain imaging devices, the SPECT scanner.
I'm going to come in and I'm going to just inject you through the IV with the goal that I'm going to try very hard not to disturb you or distract you or make any noise, and you're just going to continue to do your prayer session until it's done.
This woman is a Presbyterian minister. She's prayed to God daily for over 34 years. Right now, she's deep in prayer. At the height of her connection with God, Andy injects her with a harmless radioactive dye. Over the course of the next few minutes, as she continues to pray, the dye migrates to the parts of her brain where the blood flow is the strongest.
The brain works in a very nice way that the more active a particular part is, the more blood flow it gets, and the less active it is, the less blood flow it gets.
These are the images of her brain before and during her prayer. The redder the shade, the more active the neural area is.
This is the resting scan. This is the prayer scan, showing increased activity in the frontal lobes and in the language area of the brain.
Andy has scanned hundreds of brains in the midst of their prayer rituals, from Muslim imams to Tibetan monks to meditating atheists.
So, for example, when a person feels deeply focused on their prayer, we see increased activity in the focusing area of the brain.
This area of the brain, the frontal lobe, is intensely active when we hold conversation. Andy believes that in Judeo-Christian prayer, the frontal lobe activates just as it would in normal conversation. To the brain, talking to God is indistinguishable from talking to a person.
When we study Buddhist meditation where they're visualizing something, we might expect to see a change or an increase of activity in the visual areas of the brain.
In Buddhist practice, the divine is an abstract presence. Not a person who is directly spoken to, but rather an essence that can be visualized during deep meditation. And when Andy looks at the brains of people who do not believe in God, he finds that simple, quiet meditation produces none of the brain activity of believers.
This was a scan of an atheist. We actually had them meditating or contemplating God, showing that the frontal lobes don't activate as opposed to the person praying who does.
To an atheist, God is unimaginable. But to the believer, experiences of God are more than thoughts. They are lived sensations and just as real as the physical world that we all sense.
So it helps us to understand that at least when they're describing this to us, that they are really having this kind of an experience. What I like to say is that the experience is at least neurologically real.
And his brain studies show that all religions create neurological experiences that are just as real as if God physically existed in the world outside our brains. And if God only exists inside our brains, that does not mean God is not real. Our brains are where reality crystallizes for us.
Is certainly this notion that there is something bigger than all of us here, and whether it's the whole universe or whether there is something beyond all of that, I'm still working on that, and if I ever figure it out, I'll certainly let everyone.
Well, both. What it is, it clearly has something to do with brains, and it's something that emerges from brains. When brains get sufficiently big, presumably, as human brains have, consciousness seems to emerge. as for what it is, that's philosophically a very difficult question, which biologists are no more equipped to deal with than anybody else. Oh, nobody knows, because we don't know which animals are conscious. We don't actually technically even know that any other human being is conscious. We just, each of us know that we ourselves are conscious. We infer on pretty good grounds that other people are conscious, and it's the same sort of grounds that lead us to infer that probably chimpanzees are conscious and probably dogs are conscious. But when we come to something like earthworms and snails, it's anybody's guess. Well, that's a very difficult question, since we can't actually measure whether creatures are conscious. So I guess science has as much insight as any other subject, but I don't think I can answer that question directly. Maybe computer science has as much insight into it as any other science.
Science is about trying to get rigorous answers to questions about how nature works. And it's a very important process that's actually quite reliable if carried out correctly, with generation of hypotheses and testing of those by accumulation of data, and then drawing conclusions that are continually revisited to be sure they're right. So if you want to answer questions about how nature works, how biology works, for instance, science is the way to get there. Scientists believe in that, and they are very troubled by a suggestion that other kinds of approaches can be taken to derive truth about nature. And some, I think, have seen faith as therefore a threat to the scientific method and therefore to be resisted. But faith in its proper perspective is really asking a different set of questions, and that's why I don't think there needs to be a conflict here. The kinds of questions that faith can help one address are more in the philosophical realm. Why are we all here? Why is there something instead of nothing? Is there a God? Isn't it clear that those aren't scientific questions and that science doesn't have much to say about them? But you either have to say, well, those are inappropriate questions and we can't discuss them, or you have to say we need something besides science to pursue some of the things that humans are curious about. For me, that makes perfect sense. But I think for many scientists, particularly for those who have seen the shrill pronouncements from extreme views that threaten what they're doing scientifically and feel, therefore, that they can't really include those thoughts into their own worldview, faith can be seen as an enemy. And similarly, on the other side, some of my scientific colleagues who are of an atheist persuasion are sometimes using science as a club over the head of believers, basically suggesting that anything that can't be reduced to a scientific question isn't important, and it just represents superstition and it should be gotten rid of. Part of the problem is, I think the extremists have occupied the stage. Those voices are the ones we hear. I think most people are actually kind of comfortable with the idea that science is a reliable way to learn about nature, but it's not the whole story. And there's a place also for religion, for faith, for theology, for philosophy. But that harmony perspective doesn't get as much attention. Nobody's as interested in harmony as they are in conflict, I'm afraid.
That question of starting, the ultimate question, does it not drive you mad trying to think of that?
Well, yes,
whatever
it does.
The original thing was.
Yeah, it does.
And what it formed from.
I mean, physicists, many of them will say that you're not allowed to ask the question, what was there before the Big Bang? And I can't deal with that.
But you say you can't deal with that, but you have to accept it.
I think I'm humble enough to feel, well, what I can't deal with doesn't necessarily mean that it's undealable with. I'm coming perilously close to saying, to a sort of faith position where I'm saying, you know, I've got faith in, well, in immediate proximal sense, in other scientists that they understand it. I'm fully aware that I can't understand some things that other scientists can. And so there's a kind of element of faith.
To summarize the argument, the summary is as follows. We have an innate nature to believe in God. It's based on psychology, It's natural. It's based on sociology. It's natural. It's based on anthropological studies. It's natural to believe in God. And the belief in God is what you call an axiom. It's a self-evident truth that doesn't require any inductive or deductive arguments. For example, if you took anyone on a desert island, they'll be able to conclude that God is actually a reality. There's supernatural causal agency. And this is also called a basic belief or a properly basic belief. And some basic beliefs include that the real world is the real world, or this table is actually real. But we have no real evidence to prove that. It's an axiom, it's a basic belief. Because maybe my brain is on Mars and there's an alien with putting probes in my brain, making me think and feel what I'm feeling now and thinking now. So from this perspective, God's existence is just like a properly basic belief. Now someone may argue, well, what about the spaghetti monster or the great pumpkin? Maybe that's a properly basic belief. But that's absurd. Yes, I agree. But properly basic beliefs are basic because they don't require information transfer. If you put someone on a desert island, they'll know the real world is real, and they'll know that the island had to be created by something outside of the island, or the whole universe had to be created by something outside of the universe. In other words, a god or supernatural agency. But the knowledge of a spaghetti monster or a great pumpkin requires information transfer. Someone has to give you that information. So that's not very good, strong contention. But the main contention I want to talk to you today is probably the only strong contention against this argument, and you'll find out that it's quite weak, which is, what about the earth being flat? Or the sun going around the earth? These were properly basic beliefs, but yet we know they're not true now. Now this is true. With properly basic beliefs, you may have future evidence that denies your properly basic belief, and then you'll have to change it. Agreed. But when it comes to God's existence, do we have any evidence today that denies God's existence from an empirical or scientific perspective? No. So the idea is that you always stick with your properly basic belief until the evidence contradicts it. But the irony is, there will be no scientific or empirical evidence that could ever contradict the idea of God. Ever. I'm going to repeat that. There is no physical evidence that can ever deny strongly God's existence. The only thing physical, empirical, and scientific evidence can do is support the idea of God's existence, like we have for the fine-tuning of the constants and the natural laws of the universe to permit our existence. Therefore, there must be a fine-tuner or a designer. It can keep silent, and that's about it. It can't strongly deny God's existence because God by definition is outside of the universe, is metaphysical. You can't get God and put him in a test tube. So no amount of empirical evidence will show that God does not exist. Maybe it can show that the universe works on its own. Maybe it can show that the universe has established laws. Maybe the universe could show these things, the how, but it could never ever deny God's existence because the method of study called science focuses on the physical world. God, by definition, is not part of the physical world. So how can a method that focuses on something like the physical world now somehow focus on something that it's not supposed to focus on? So this is why, although it's a valid contention that some properly basic beliefs can be changed due to our future scientific findings, but when it comes to God's existence, there will be no scientific finding that can ever deny his existence. Maybe it can tell us that we were wrong in the way we thought the world works, but how can it deny a being that's outside of the universe? Because science still has an assumption of causality. Science still has the same kind of basic assumptions that we use to infer God's existence. And also, science as a method of study cannot really deny God's existence because what physical evidence is there to deny his existence? You can't, because God itself is outside of the physical world. All it can do is strongly suggest he exists or just keep silent on the topic.
The question as to whether or not we are hardwired for religion and spirituality, I think is a very important one. When we look at how the brain works, it looks like the brain is able to very easily engage in religious and spiritual practices, ideas, and experiences. All the brain scan studies that we've done show that there are multiple parts of the brain that seem to get involved. So it really does look like the brain is so easily capable of having these experiences. Now, exactly how that ability got into the brain is, of course, a much more complex and both philosophical and scientific question. The scientists would say, well, maybe it was through millions of years of evolution that because being religious or spiritual was an adaptive process, it got incorporated into the biological mechanisms of the brain. And there's certainly a lot of reasons to support that. And of course, if you're a religious individual, it also makes sense that if there's a God up there and we're down here, that we would have a brain that's capable of communicating to God, praying to God, doing the things that God needs us to do. Otherwise, there would be this kind of fundamentally silly disconnect. We wouldn't be able to have any kind of interaction with God. So it does look like the brain, no matter how it got there, does have this profound ability to engage in religious and spiritual experiences, and that's part of why we've seen religion and spirituality be a part of human history since the very dawn of civilization. One of the things that we find to be such an important element of many of the rituals and practices that people do as part of their religious traditions is the repetition of it. The more that you come back to a particular idea, the more you focus on it, the more you say a phrase or a prayer, those are the ideas and beliefs that become written into the neural connections of the brain. There's a cute saying that neurons that fire together wire together. The idea is that when you are doing a particular practice, whatever it is, religious or otherwise, the more you do it, the more you are writing that information into the neural connections of the brain. The neurons that support that idea or support that practice fire together, they strengthen their connections, and it makes it easier for you to come back to that particular practice, and it also strengthens the beliefs that are around that particular practice. Now, that's also why we think that a practice like meditation, even taken into a more secular kind of context, can be a very powerful tool for helping to improve the way a person's brain works.
And I think that's perfectly defensible. We spoke a moment ago about our knowledge of the external world. There's no way to prove that the external world exists. There's no way to prove you're not a brain in a vat of chemicals wired up with electrodes to think that we're here in this room having this conversation. Similarly, there's no way to prove that the past is real, that everything wasn't created 5 minutes ago with built-in memory traces and appearances of age. These are what philosophers call properly basic beliefs. They lie at the foundations of our system of beliefs. Now, these beliefs aren't arbitrary. They're rooted in experience, my experience of seeing and feeling and smelling objects and remembering the past and so forth. So these beliefs are grounded in experience, but they're properly basic beliefs to my foundational system of beliefs. And I would say similarly, the belief that God exists is, for those who experience Him, a properly basic belief rooted in the experience of God Himself. And in the absence of some overwhelming defeater or objection to belief in God, the believer is perfectly rational to accept that God exists, just as we are perfectly rational to believe in the external world or the reality of the past.
So therefore that contention, I think, is dealt with. Let me just summarize again. The contention was, okay, probably basic beliefs, it makes sense, but what about the earth being flat? Or the sun going around the earth? That was a properly basic belief, but we've changed our beliefs because of the evidence. Agreed. But it doesn't follow that there may be a potential change of your properly basic belief that you change your belief now. You only change your properly basic beliefs when you've seen the evidence. And what physical evidence is there to actually deny God's existence? None. And also, will there ever be physical evidence or empirical evidence to deny His existence? No, because outside of the scope of the scientific method. It's outside of the scope. If we read the works of Alex Rosenberg, Elliot Sober, and others, philosophers of science, we see that science has a limited scope. It deals with the physical world. God is not part of the physical world, so they can't really directly address it, which means He can never directly say God does not exist. They can suggest that we don't have empirical evidence. They can suggest, for instance, that there is some evidence that leads to His existence, but they can't directly deny His existence using the empirical scientific paradigm.
Alvin, you've taken a fascinating approach to the concept of naturalism, that the substance of reality is only physical, and you use an evolutionary argument. How does that work?
Well, first, I would say naturalism is the idea that there isn't any such person as God. or anything like God. So naturalism is stronger than atheism. You could be an atheist without rising to the full heights or descending to the full depths of being a naturalist. So if you didn't think there was any such person as God, but you thought there was something like Plato's idea of the good, let's say, then you would be an atheist but not a naturalist. And my argument is against naturalism, really. Now, when I speak of evolution, I just mean what everybody else means by this, the idea that we human beings have come to be by some process of descent with modification, where the driving force behind the process, you might say, would be natural selection working on or winnowing some source of genetic variation. Random genetic mutation is the usual suspect, you might say. And what I think is the case is I don't think you can sensibly believe these two things together. I mean, it often seems like people think of evolution as a pillar in the temple of naturalism, but I think they conflict with each other.
That's fascinating thought. So let's understand it, because most people would say just the opposite, that if evolution is one of the cardinal proofs of naturalism and that the world is only physical. I mean, that's what people would tend to think.
Yeah, that's what some people think, and I think those people are wrong. I think, as I say, you can't sensibly believe in both naturalism and evolution. This argument has to do with the reliability of your cognitive faculties, like memory and perception, a priori intuition, or mathematical and logical intuition. Maybe there are others, induction, let's say, whereby you know something about the future by virtue of knowing about the past, etc. These cognitive faculties, I think if you accept naturalism and evolution, you can't think of your cognitive faculties as being reliable, as giving you the actual truth about the world. And the argument goes like this. If you're a naturalist, you'll probably also be a materialist about human beings. You'll think that human beings are material objects. They're not souls, immaterial souls that have a body or own a body or work in a body or whatever. They are material objects.
The only thing that exists are material, physical objects, and nothing else exists.
Right. So if that's the case, then you'll be a materialist. And if you're now suppose we think about not ourselves, but about creatures on some alien planet that are a lot like us, maybe a planet revolving around Arcturus. So these creatures, let's suppose that for them naturalism holds. As things stand for them, naturalism is true. And also that evolution holds, and also these people then are material objects. These beings, creatures, are material objects. So what is it that causes their behavior? Well, what causes their behavior in a sort of proximate sense will be their neurology, the states in which the brains are. So a bunch of neurons fire, send a signal down a nerve, let's say, to a muscle, causing it to contract, and my arm goes up. That's how behavior gets there, right? So behavior is caused by their neurology, and also their beliefs, what they believe, and the content of their beliefs. That's also caused by their neurology. Now, given that evolution is true, that these creatures have come to be by virtue of natural selection, winnowing some form of genetic variation, we can take it for granted that their behavior is adaptive. It enhances their fitness. It leads to survival and reproduction. And if that's true, then the same thing will go for what causes their behavior, namely their neurology. We can think of that too as being adaptive, causing the right kind of behavior, therefore being such as to promote survival and reproduction. Now, the neurology that causes their beliefs, that causes their behavior, also causes their beliefs. And now the question is, okay, suppose their behavior and their neurology is in fact adaptive. What about their beliefs? What about the truth of these beliefs? Well, I think you can see that it doesn't matter about the truth of these beliefs. If the neurology causes the right behavior, the adaptive behavior, what they believe makes no difference. The belief, you might say, floats along as an extra. There it is. They hold these beliefs. That's caused by the neurology. The neurology is adaptive. But the beliefs don't have to be true for the neurology to be adaptive. If the neurology causes false beliefs but causes the right behavior, makes no difference whatever. So if you take a given belief, say any particular belief on the part of one of these creatures, and ask, what's the probability, given that naturalism and evolution and materialism, that the belief is true, it's got to be fairly close to 50-50. It'll be as likely to be true as false, but as likely to be false as true. And if that's the case, then the probability that their cognitive faculties are reliable, I mean, produce the substantial proportion of true beliefs over false beliefs that reliability requires, the probability that their faculties will be reliable, that'll be very low. All right? So there's the first step in the argument. The probability for these other creatures, the probability of reliability on naturalism and evolution, that's low. Okay.
Atheism tells you, at least Richard tells us in his book, that since human life has been cobbled together by unguided evolution, it's unlikely that our view of the world is accurate. Quite so. And if you are a reductionist, as you must be as a materialist, reducing beliefs to the physics and chemistry of neurological structures, then it raises a very big question, ladies and gentlemen. If in the end my beliefs, my theories, my scientific theories, are the results ultimately of the motions of atoms in my brain produced by an unguided, random, mindless process, why should I believe them? In other words, it's like someone sitting on the branch of a tree cutting off the branch on which they're sitting. And it seems to me that therefore atheism actually undercuts the scientific endeavor very seriously. And that, for my mind, is a fatal flaw. An argument that purports to derive rationality from irrationality doesn't even rise, in my opinion, to the dignity of being an intelligible delusion. It is logically incoherent. But theism tells us that the reason science is possible, the reason that I can access the universe, at least in part through my human intelligence, is because the same God who created the universe is ultimately responsible for the human mind in here.
Okay, but wouldn't one think that the beliefs would be closer to true than not if the behaviors are adaptive?
That's the question. Why should that be true? The behaviors are adaptive, the neurology that produces the behavior is also adaptive, that neurology also produces these beliefs, but as long as the behavior and neurology are adaptive, what does it matter whether the beliefs are true or false? It makes no difference to the adaptiveness. Natural selection is interested in adaptive behavior. And in adaptive causes of behavior, say neurology. It doesn't give a hoot about whether your beliefs are true or false. You can believe whatever you want as far as natural selection goes, as long as you behave in the right way.
Okay, so if I give you that, where are you taking me?
Well, that's the first step. Now, next, if that holds for these creatures, then it's got to hold for us as well, right? If that's the way things stand with them, then for us too, it's true that if we're produced by evolution and if naturalism is true, then the probability that our beliefs, that our cognitive faculties are reliable, that probability will be low. Now, if you understand and see that if you believe naturalism and evolution and see that the probability of your beliefs of your faculties being reliable given naturalism and evolution is low, then you have a defeater for the proposition, for your natural instinctive belief that your cognitive faculties are reliable. We all assume that our faculties are reliable, and I would say quite properly so. But you get a defeater for it, a reason not to hold that belief, a reason to reject it, to give it up. You get a defeater for that belief in your belief that, in your belief that naturalism and evolution are true, and then you're seeing that the probability of your faculties being reliable, given naturalism and evolution, is low. So that's the second step. Anybody who sees this as a defeater for the proposition that his faculties are reliable. And then the next step is, if you have a defeater for R, you have a defeater for any belief that you take to be produced by your cognitive faculties. I mean, just as if you have a defeater for your initial impression that this thermometer is reliable, then you also have a defeater for any particular belief you've formed on the basis of what it says. Okay, so then you've got but of course that's all of your beliefs. All of your beliefs are produced by your cognitive faculties, right? So you've got a defeater for all of your beliefs then, in which case you also, of course, have a defeater for naturalism and evolution, that combination itself.
So what you're saying is that it becomes self-referentially destructive.
Yeah, it's like shooting yourself in the foot, you might say, right?
Or do we have like total skepticism? Now I just don't know anything?
I think that's what what I think a naturalist should really conclude, that he doesn't know anything. He could be right, he could be wrong. He has to adopt a position of complete skepticism.
Well, common sense, of course, comes from what was necessary for our brains to survive in the Pleistocene of Africa. So they had to survive. They had to know how to catch a buffalo and how to find a waterhole and how to climb a tree when being pursued by a lion or something. So our brains were never shaped by natural selection to understand either quantum mechanics, the theory of the very small, or relativity, the theory of the very fast. And it's actually an astonishing compliment to the human brain that at least some humans are capable of understanding.
No, it is really remarkable that we've been able to get as far as we can. But you hit on another point. Our brains not only didn't evolve to understand those aspects of the universe that it couldn't experience directly, but another aspect of the universe that it can't experience directly is long time.
Absolutely.
And I think that's another reason why evolution is such a hard concept.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Innal hamdalillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. To proceed, brothers and sisters and friends, I greet you with the warmest Islamic greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. May the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. My friend is an atheist, and he says, I am an atheist. That's very interesting, because the minute he says, I am an atheist, actually proves God's existence. Why? Because who is this I? Who is this conscious being? What is this conscious being? What is this unified conscious reality that says, I am an atheist? And that's a good question. Because I would argue, consciousness implies God's existence. Now, yes, we know the brain works. And not only does it work, but it helps us concerning thinking and thoughts and feelings and memories and dreams. We know this. We know that we have electrochemical activity when we eat, when we talk, when we feel pain. This is all true. But there is something mysterious about what it means to be you and me, what it means to be an I. And that is called the hard problem of consciousness. Professor David Chalmers, Professor Nagel, and others have said there is a reality of consciousness that cannot be explained via materialism or via science or via empiricism. And this is the hard problem of consciousness. Now, what is the hard problem of consciousness? Well, basically, it is what it is to be like a human being, what it is like to eat a strawberry, what it is like for you to fall in love, what it is like for you to have some chocolate. This likeness, what it is like to be, is something that we can never find out via science or materialism. Not only that, if we were to know everything about the brain and map out all the chemical, electro, biological, neuroactivity, we would still never be able to find out what it is like for me to eat a strawberry. Now, yes, if I'm eating a strawberry, you could find some electrochemical neuroactivity that is saying he's eating something, and even that he's eating a strawberry. But you can never ever find out what it is like for me to eat a strawberry. This is the hard problem of consciousness, this inner experience. And this cannot be explained by science or by materialism. Actually, the only way that science can explain this is by ignoring the fact that we have inner subjective experiences. So what's the best explanation? Well, obviously, it's God. Because if in the beginning of the universe, all you had was just matter, and you rearrange these chunks of matter, you will never get mind, you will never get consciousness. But if in the beginning of the universe, you had an all-aware being, then it follows it can create matter and create consciousness, and that they can interact together. So this is why God is the best explanation for the fact that you are you, and the fact that you can say, I am an atheist, because the I means that you have a subjective, conscious reality and experience, and that's only best explained by God.
Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَلَا تَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ نَسُوا اللَّهَ فَأَنْسَاهُمْ أَنفُسَهُم. Don't be like those who forgot about Allah, and as a result, Allah made them forget about themselves. So the question you have to ask yourself is, how is it that the moment I forget about Allah, I'm therefore forgetting about myself? What's the correlation here? Well, the idea is that if you take a person who completely rejects the idea of a creator, you're kind of rejecting the idea of anything divine. You'll often hear the atheists say, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in any angels, and therefore I don't believe in the soul either. Now, the moment you reject the idea of the soul, what are you left with? What is a human being? A human being is really just a product of two factors, nature and nurture. Now, your nature is what you're a result of because of your parents. Essentially, the sperm and the egg that produced your DNA, that produced your body, you have to admit that these things were not chosen. Nobody chose to be born, male or female, or their race, or any of these factors. Nobody chose their DNA. And so therefore, nobody chose their brain. Then if you look at nurture, did anybody choose where they were born, or the first things they interacted with, or the first things that they saw? No. So really, if you're just a product of nature and nurture, both of which you have not chosen, then you have to admit you don't have any choice. You don't have any free will. Now, what is free will? Essentially, it's your identity. When you think about how you identify somebody, you say, oh, this guy's a nice guy. Why is he a nice guy? Well, what you're really saying is that he makes nice choices. He chooses to be kind. He chooses to be generous, etc. These descriptions of an identity is based on choices. And so the moment you remove the idea of a soul and remove the idea of choice, you remove the idea of identity as well. I think an easy way of understanding this is by simply taking a look at Siri. Siri, right, on everybody's phone, doesn't have any free will. Now, even if it might appear that way, let's say theoretically, a child picks up a phone and that phone says, I am an atheist. Now, the moment that Siri said that, the child might think, oh, this phone has an opinion. This phone, is an atheist. And what would you tell this child? You'd say, look, I understand that it might look that way because the phone spoke. But the reality is that there's factors that cause this. In other words, the phone was manufactured, it had a nature, it was manufactured in a factory, and then it was sold and somebody bought it and somebody typed in these words, I am an atheist, and that was its nurture, both of which, is this sounding familiar? Both of which, the nature and the nurture, Siri didn't choose. And therefore, when Siri said, I am an atheist, the reality is that she really wasn't saying anything. She's not even a she. She's just a reaction. Some of you might be thinking, why is this Muslim talking about beliefs in atheism? Well, you don't have to take it from me. You can take a look at the very famous Richard Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss. They're talking about how, from their perspective, there's no room for free will. Even Stephen Hawking, the famous physicist, has a quote where he describes human beings as having the illusion of choice.
Of free will. Now most people think we have a strong subjective experience of free will. And the problem is just that we can't map it on to physical reality. This, I think, is an illusion. I think we actually do not feel as free as we think we do. This relies on us not paying very close attention to what it's like to be us. If you pay attention, you can see that you no more author the next thing you think than the next thing I say. Thoughts just emerge in consciousness. We are not authoring them. That would require that we think them before we think them. If you can't control your next thought, and you don't know what it's going to be until it arises, where's your freedom of will? The truth is, we feel or presume an authorship over our actions, over a certain and thoughts, over a certain channel of information in our conscious minds that is illusory. So how can we be free as conscious agents if everything that we consciously intend is caused by things we did not intend, which we are entirely unaware? We can't. From the perspective of your conscious mind, you are actually no more responsible for your next thought than you are for your birth into this world. You have not built your mind. And in moments where you seem to build it, where you finally take the reins of your life and you decide to acquire knowledge or learn a new skill, the only tools at your disposal are those which you've inherited from moments past. No one picks their parents or the society to which they were born. No one picks the moment in history in which they live. No one picks their genes or the environmental influences that determine the structure of their brain. You are no more responsible for the exact structure and state of your brain in this moment than you are for your height. What you do based on conscious, predetermined decisions says more about you than anything else. Thoughts simply arise in the mind. But the idea that we as conscious beings are deeply responsible for the characters of our minds simply can't be mapped onto reality. And if we want to be guided by reality, rather than by the fantasy lives of our ancestors, I think we have to revise our view.
In my experience, many atheists do believe in free will. And you explain to them that, look, it really doesn't make sense. There's no room for it. They say, well, complexity. That's one argument I hear a lot. The mind is so complex that somehow free will is inserted into it. Well, it doesn't really matter how complex an object is. I might not understand all the inner workings of my laptop, but I know that it's, breakdownable. I know that you can take a look at all the different causes and effects and eventually predict and understand how it's going to operate. So similarly, our brain, even though it's way more complex, so complicated, and we don't understand all of it, we still do know that what is inside of our bodies are made up of molecules. Our bodies are made up of, atoms, and these things are just reacting to their environment. So if you think about Newton's first law, where he explains that a body of matter will remain in a static state until an outside force is acted upon it. Well, if that's the case, then we as human beings were just made up of matter. And we were wound up like a clock inside of the wombs of our mothers, and everything else is just stimulus, making us react. And it doesn't really matter how complex that reaction is because it's all just cause and effect. There is no magical matter inside of our minds or inside of our bodies. It's just the same type of matter you can find at the grocery store. But why is it that so many atheists believe in free will? I would argue that the appeal of atheism, to a large degree, is the concept of freedom. You think to yourself, I don't have to be shackled by the rules of some God, or I don't want to be judged every moment of every day and then, have to pay for whatever I've done. I find that atheism is promoted, it's advertised through the concept of free will. In fact, if you take a look at the following image, you'll see this atheist campaign in which it reads, "There's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life." Think about that last portion. Enjoy your life. Another way of saying that is just exercise your free will. Do whatever you want. In conclusion, the moment somebody says, I'm an atheist, you can always ask them, well, do you believe in free will? If they say yes, then they have a really hard time justifying why they do. I mean, think about it. What are they going to say? Yes, I do, but I know that I'm from nature and nurture, and there are no other factors. I didn't choose nature, I didn't choose nurture. The argument of complexity doesn't make any sense. So anywhere the atheist turns, he's kind of stuck. And then you can always point to those leaders that I referenced earlier. And they explain very clearly that, look, there's no room for free will in atheism. So he's stuck with saying no. But like we mentioned earlier, the moment he says, no, I don't believe in free will, then you saying the words, I don't believe in free will, wasn't your choice. You chose to do it as much as Siri. And Siri is not an atheist. And you know that and I know that. So really, if you really want to put it concisely, just take the sentence, I am an atheist, right? The moment you ask the question, do you believe in choice? If the person says, yes, I believe in choice, you can put an X on the word atheist. They're not atheist. I'm sorry. If you believe in choice, that means you believe in some kind of a soul, something that is supernatural, something that allows you to make choices that is not just a reaction, not just a cause and effect. And that's what your soul is, and that's what I'm advocating that you have. But if the person says, no, I reject the idea of free will, well, then you can put an X on the words I am, because you don't have free will.
Newtonian determinism says that the universe is a clock. A gigantic clock that's wound up at the beginning of time, and it's been ticking ever since according to Newton's laws of motion. So, what you're going to eat 10 years from now, on January 1st, has already been fixed. It's already known using Newton's laws of motion. Einstein believed in that. Einstein was a determinist. Does that mean that a murderer, a horrible mass murderer, isn't really guilty of his works because it was already preordained billions of years ago? Einstein said, well, yeah, in some sense that's true. Even mass murderers were predetermined. But, he said, they should still be placed in jail. Heisenberg then comes along and proposes the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and says, nonsense. There's uncertainty. You don't know where the electron is. It could be here, here, or many places simultaneously. This, of course, Einstein hated because he said God doesn't play dice with the universe. Well, hey, get used to it. Einstein was wrong. God does play dice. Every time we look at an electron, it moves. There's uncertainty with regards to the position of the electron. So what does that mean for free will? It means in some sense we do have some kind of free will. No one can determine your future events given your past history. There's always the wild card. There's always the possibility of uncertainty in whatever we do. So when I look at myself in a mirror, I say to myself, what I'm looking at is not really me. It looks like me, but it's not really me at all. It's not me today, now. It's me a billionth of a second ago, because it takes a billionth of a second for light to go from me to the mirror and back.
Now, I would argue that Dawkins' argument couldn't be any further from the truth. This is because the universe that we live in actually makes more sense being created by God for the following reasons. The first reason being that the universe is ordered and open to rational analysis. Now, brothers, sisters, and friends, if God did not exist, then the universe will not display the order that it does. And it will not be finely tuned to permit our existence. As Roger Penrose states, there is a certain sense in which I would say the universe has a purpose. It's not there just somehow by chance. I don't think that's a very fruitful or helpful way of looking at the universe. Additionally, the very fact that we can observe and perform rational analysis on the patterns we perceive in the universe makes more sense if God did exist. Because in a naturalistic universe, things would be expected to be more chaotic. Now, this does not mean a universe without God cannot be ordered. However, it is more likely that God would create an ordered universe, and since the universe we live in is ordered, it makes sense that God's existence fits well with our universe. Also, I would argue that the universe contains consciousness and beings that are aware, and therefore our universe makes more sense that God exists. Now, a universe that contains consciousness, brothers, sisters, and friends, makes more sense with the existence of God, because a universe without God would be very different to the one we're living in. Now, let me explain this. Now, brothers, sisters, and friends, human beings experience things all the time. This show that you listen to is an experience. Even talking about your experience is an experience. However, the ultimate reality that we know from any experience is that the one who experiences it, in other words, ourselves, is the ultimate reality. Now, when we realize that there is a first person, an I, me, or mine, we come to face a profound mystery. Now, the philosopher Roy Abraham Varghese puts it nicely when he wrote, "To reverse Descartes, I am, therefore I think. Who is this I? Where is it? How did it come to be? Yourself is not just something physical." Now, I would agree with the professor, the philosopher, because the self is not a physical thing. It is not contained in any cell or biological structure. Because the most unchallenged and intuitive reality is that we are all aware, but we cannot describe or explain what this awareness is. One thing that we can be sure of is that the self cannot be explained naturalistically or chemically. The main reason for this is that science does not discover the self. It is actually the other way around. For science to try and explain the truth of the self, or consciousness, or awareness, would be tantamount of arguing in a circle. Even scientists recognize this. The physicist Gerald Schroeder points out that there is no real difference between a heap of sand and the brain of an Einstein. So the advocates of a physical explanation for the self end up in a muddle, as they require answer to even bigger questions such as, how can certain bits of matter suddenly create a new reality that has no resemblance to matter? So brothers, sisters and friends, if the self or consciousness or awareness cannot be explained physically, then the next question must be asked. How did it come to be? Well, the history of the universe indicates that consciousness spontaneously arose, and language emerged without any evolutionary forerunner. So where did it come from? Even the neo-atheists have failed to come to terms with the nature of the self and its source, because no physical explanation is coherent enough to be convincing. This is why Richard Dawkins, he almost admits defeat, and he says, "We don't know, we don't understand." Now, brothers, sisters, and friends, the best explanation for the nature and source of the self is that it came from a source that is thinking, aware, and conscious. How else can the self, which is an entity with the capacity to reflect and experience, manifest itself? It cannot have come from an unconscious matter incapable to experience and ponder. Simply put, matter cannot produce concepts and perceptions. Therefore, we can conclude that the self cannot have a material basis, but must have come from a living source that transcends the material world. And this is best explained by God. No other answer provides an adequate explanation for this phenomenon, brothers and sisters and friends.